Politics and issues surrounding our southern border, such as immigration and crime, are highly charged subjects which seem eternally connected together. News media of all types display in print, audio, and video the drumbeat of habitual partisan talking points concerning mostly perceived threats to life and property, and are often summarized under the catch-all term border crime. The pandering tone of our politicians may be very tightly linked to television news and its incentive for profit and its resulting influence on public opinion. During this presentation, I'll discuss the effects of television broadcast news on the politics of border crime and the theoretical links that connect TV news directly into the policy platforms of our political leaders. I'll start my presentation by discussing the concept of border crime as it appears to various stakeholders throughout the country. Next, I'll give a summary of statistics on crime along our southern border as gathered by the FBI Uniform Crime Reports and summarized in July of 2011 by the USA Today news organization. I'll then talk about the effect of national and local television news on public opinion. This will include several studies that will show a correlation between TV news and its emotional impact on its audience. Finally, I'll review the influence of television news on politicians willing to use the momentum of this medium to shape political platforms, influence public policy, and promote desired political goals. Certainly, your exposure to crime along our southern border is starkly different depending on which side of this 2,000-mile boundary you live on. For example, if you live in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico in 2009, your chances of being killed by homicide would have been a staggering 1 in 400. An unscientific napkin calculation that I did tells me that if you were lucky enough to survive all other forms of death, that by your 80th birthday you would have also survived a 1 in 5 chance of being murdered. Although the results of this crime play an influential role in public opinion in Mexico, I'll only address its impact on the people in this country. National and international security organizations have codified definitions of crimes along our border. The U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency, for example, has broadly identified the crimes that they're concerned with in a recent National Border Patrol strategy document. These include the movements of terrorists and their weapons, as well as the smuggling of people, drugs, and contraband. Antonio Mazzatelli from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime summarizes border crimes as smuggling committed by international crime organizations. In the case of our Mexican border, these crimes include the illegal movement of guns and money south into Mexico and the illegal movement of people and drugs north into the United States. Local law enforcement agencies along the border are broadly separated into two groups: those that serve and protect urban areas such as border towns and cities, and those that serve and protect the rest of the borderlands. These areas include large rural expanses of sparsely populated desert, many square miles of which have no permanent residents. The impacts to local law enforcement of crimes along the border are different based on the location and the jurisdiction of the offense. The border smuggling crimes mentioned earlier are associated with a number of ancillary violence committed in the act of smuggling. Since the post-September 11th focus on border security at highly populated border areas, the north and south migrations of smugglers has moved away from the urban centers and into less easily patrolled rural settings. The rural police, such as county sheriffs, have seen a rise on average in crime, while municipal police on the border towns have seen a decline in most crime over the past 10 years. Nogales Police Chief Jeffrey Kirkland responds to misconceptions about crime in his city in the following clip.
When people talk about drug-related homicides and those things happening on the border, it certainly isn't here.
Police Chief Jeffrey Kirkham has been in the Nogales area for only a year, but says people often confuse Nogales, Sonora with Nogales, Arizona, and that his side of the border is safe.
There is no huge violent crime rate. While they occur on the other side of the border, and we're right on the border. They don't occur here on the U.S. side.
To the Nogales Police Department, they have seen an 11% decrease in crime over the past year. Crimes like aggravated assaults and burglary, and not one murder in 2010.
Sheriff Nogales also gives some credit to the efforts of outside agencies like Border Patrol, Customs and Border Protection, and DPS for playing a role in those falling crime numbers.
The final group of stakeholders with concerns about border crime is the general population of the United States. If we divide this set of people into two groups, Hispanics and non-Hispanics, we can say that most non-Hispanics derive most of their information concerning border crime from national television broadcasts. Hispanics live in the highest concentrations and numbers within states bordering Mexico, and therefore get a higher percentage of their information from local television news, which covers local border events more often than in states not bordering Mexico. This population has more access to border issue information through personal experience with friends, acquaintances, and family members than non-Hispanic residents. 3 out of 4 Hispanic U.S. citizens in a 2007 national survey of Latinos believes that illegal immigrants are helping the U.S. economy. This ethnic group recognizes that although the law defines human smuggling as a crime, the majority do not believe that the immigrants are criminals. The U.S. crime rate within 100 miles of the Mexican border has declined steadily from 1998 through 2009. According to a recent USA Today analysis of FBI data, almost every major crime reporting category in this borderline area has been below the national average for every year during the same period. What's more, the crime rates in most jurisdictions along the border are below their state's averages. Here is a graphic displayed at the USA Today website showing the trends in murder rate along our border. The chart shows in green the number of murders per 100,000 people reported by police jurisdictions within 100 miles of the border. I think the interesting thing to note in this chart is that the average murder rate within 100 miles of our border is always lower than the average murder rate in the rest of the nation. And this flies in the face of a lot of people's thoughts about crime along the border. It is simply not as prevalent as it is throughout the rest of the nation. And this applies to all other forms of crime along the border too. With few exceptions, the average murder rate, the average crime rate along the border for robbery, larceny, other forms of crime is always lower than the national average. And I have a few charts that demonstrate this that were retrieved from the USA Today website. Here are some additional charts from USA Today that clearly show the trends of crime along the border as compared to the average crime rate throughout the rest of the nation, although it sort of vaguely illustrates the details because of the resolution of my capture software. But in these charts, you can see that assault, rape, robbery, larceny, burglaries, and murder, which I showed earlier, were all sloping downward with the same trend as the rest of the nation, but more importantly, all of these trends, or nearly all of these trends, are below the national average. I need to add a caveat to this data and the analysis by saying that the data and the analysis only represents a period of time ending in 2009, and events along the border are constantly changing, and so the validity of extending that data into the current period of time may not be appropriate. The 2010 data is available, but the analysis is not complete, and of course the 2011 data and analysis are not complete either. How have television news media dealt with border crime and border news? To answer this question, I'll first divide TV news media into two broad categories, since they have very different audiences with different ranges of interest. According to a 2011 journal report, local news agencies tend to focus on crime, social costs, and job competition when reporting on border crime, while National television tends to focus on national security and safety when covering these same geographic areas. The NBC network has been presenting national news coverage since 1940. In its formative years through 1980, I could find no records of news stories covering the Mexican border. The trend in the number of border news stories created by NBC from 1980 through 2005 has been gradually a positive one, as shown in this following histogram. A literal exponential increase in border coverage started in 2004, and if this accelerating trend were to continue unchecked by the year 2071, we would see nothing but border-related news stories on NBC Nightly News. Two potential reasons for this added coverage may have been President Bush's introduction of the Fair and Secure Immigration Reform proposal in 2004 and the declaration of the state of emergency by Governor Bill Richardson of New Mexico, because he claimed that the ravages of illegal alien crime had devastated his state. Concerning the content of added national news coverage, the National Association of Hispanic Journalists showed that immigrants are frequently linked to crime in national news. Therefore, television news stories are likely to mention crime as a consequence of illegal immigration. National news, as well as local television news programs, share a need to provide dramatic stories with appealing visuals. Crime news stories provide the ideal topics for these two requirements. An unrelenting link between border stories and crime has been well documented. Local television news is often subject to aggressive competition from local networks. Unlike newspapers, which are often the only local source of printed news, broadcast news often consists of many local stations, and the need to compete for market share is ongoing. These sometimes remote connections between border news stories and crime can be achieved because of the need to frame news accounts required simply to coalesce the many discrete facts surrounding a news story into one coherent narrative. This packaging process involves the retention of some pieces of information while eliminating others. It's during this selection process that the news organization can promote a particular problem, leading its audience towards a desired line of reasoning or interpretation. Entman, in 1993, says that framing defines a problem, diagnoses a cause, and suggests a remedy. The television media can lead an audience to judge who is to blame for a problem based on different frames which are based on the same original factual content. This is done not by presenting non-factual information, but simply by removing certain facts from the final story. These, in my opinion, are sins of omission, and are framed by the typically short news segments presented on national television news. One study determined that the average length of a news story was about 1 minute on CNN, with a maximum of about 2 minutes on NBC. The lack of context required by these brief segments and the highly predictive quality of stories surrounding immigration and politics reinforces studies that demonstrate that media can tell its audience how to think about social problems and how to evaluate their solutions. I have never heard a television news report, either nationally or locally, that has mentioned the possible benefits of illegal aliens, though I've heard many linking border crime to aliens who have entered the country illegally. One recent local news broadcast devoted most of its news coverage to border issues and ended each piece in a menacing tone. Here's a highly abridged copy of this half-hour television news show.
On your side, news at 10.
The unprecedented recall election sent the president of the Arizona Senate packing, cost the force behind SB 1070 his job.
I think that SB 1070 and the kind of politics that Russell Pierce represents.
Vic Williams sees the recall as a political tactic and says SB 1070 was not involved.
The liberals, if they can't win at the polls through regular means, are going to use this new page out of their playbook to try to manipulate our elections.
Do you see an impact on the legislature taking action on future immigration issues?
No,
as a result of this change?
No, absolutely not. Once again, you know, look, the state of Arizona, the Republican caucus, which is a supermajority, along with a very conservative governor, Governor Brewer, we're going to make sure that Arizona is protected from state. We're going to protect Arizona with state-based illegal immigration laws.
Senator Pierce is highly critical of the federal government, especially when it comes to border security. He often says the feds are not doing enough on the ground to keep others out. But what about in the air? We'll show you what's being done to secure the border from the sky and solve a decades-long mystery.
It's just after sunrise on a cool October.
Okay, we're both in. Here we go.
Their mission, airlift Border Patrol agents to mountaintop locations to scout, track, or chase down the bad guys. We arrive at a forward operating base near Douglas.
Here you go. Right. 3, 2, 1, left there, right there.
Rancher Rob Krantz was murdered in 2010 by a suspected smuggler just a few miles away.
A number of studies have proposed models for depicting the fear of crime, including border crime, with exposure to television programming. Substitution theory, proposing that people with no personal experience with crime, or by extension a region, will pick up their emotionally driven opinions from television programs that they watch. In other words, they are substituting their lack of exposure to these situations with their observations made on TV, including the news. Resonance theory, which suggests that a shred of personal experience that aligns with a television program suspends disbelief for much of the rest of that message. With no disrespect, a poor analogy is this scam artist who's looking to make a personal connection through some tidbit of common information with his mark, and then proceeding to sell that person the Brooklyn Bridge. As I said, that's a bad example, but it helps stick the resonance theory in my mind. Finally, cultivation theory states that the message will grow more and more believable within the viewer with repeated exposure to the message. My observation is from people I've known that those who think television and repeated exposure to it affects them, not at all. Those are the people that seem to be most affected. And people who claim that television does affect them seem to be least affected. That's just been my casual observation over my lifetime and career. Anyway, none of these models attempts to show that there is no impact of television on its audience. If there were no persuasive properties to television, or more importantly, television news, there'd be no revenue stream for TV stations. Every advertisement is a sales job that would like to, and obviously does, find traction with one or more of these three ideas. With the ideas presented so far, we can develop a positive feedback loop between television, news, and the viewing audience that it covers. A local news broadcast in the borderlands will have a finite potential viewing audience based on its assigned coverage area and the number of people living in that area. There will be an average of consensus on any social issue within this viewing population, and a local news station can judge the flavor of that consensus in many ways, but most obviously they can do it by measuring the rise and decline of its viewership. When a local station frames its news in line with the opinions of most of its potential viewers, then its ratings will climb and its revenues will grow as well. If the station swims against the local social will of its viewers, then they will stop watching to some degree, revenues will fall, and the faint of heart at the local station will start framing their news with the local currents in mind. In the case of border issues and the real or implied threat of border crime, local stations can find the desired emotional stories and visuals in these topics, creating the seeds of fear through cultivation and resonance, and substitution to some extent. When this fear turns into a larger public perception, it is recognized by the local stations, and the flames are fanned and framed even higher in the hopes of gaining viewers and revenue. This now becomes a self-inflating feedback loop that obviously has mitigating forces, but nonetheless tends to raise the perceptions and the fears of viewers beyond the non-television affirmed levels, and certainly far beyond what the actual threats would suggest. A second positive feedback loop exists between elected politicians and their constituents. This mutually reinforced relationship exists when elected officials respond to the needs and desires of their voters by passing legislation that the voters feel is needed while reciting policy platforms that voters agree with. The voters, of course, respond to this legislation and rhetoric by supplying the votes to maintain their officials in office. The connection between television news and its influence on politics is seen when these two feedback loops are joined together with a juncture at the point of television audience perceptions, which are also the perceptions of a large block of voters. As described earlier, the perceptions of television viewers can be skewed by the repeated and dramatic news coverage often surrounding border issues. This exaggerated opinion of crime and danger is reinforced by the financial requirements of television news, which frames their message towards the existing predilections of their audience. Politicians are driven to respond to this same exaggerated opinion of border crime, in this case, in order to gain the votes and stay in office. Taken to the extreme, a mountain of fear can be generated from a molehill of border crime. This overstated danger leads to political pressure to react through political policy and legislation. Senator John McCain has admitted in the following news clip to this political pressure, in which he responds to constituent fear of rising border crime, when in fact it is a falling rate of border crime.
Interview, McCain acknowledges he has shifted.
I would say that a certain amount of emphasis has changed with the changing situation.
Defending the change, he says his constituents are more afraid today because of increasing border violence.
So it's their priority, so it has to be my priority. I represent them.
In summary, local television news is driven to provide framed stories with dramatic visuals, and crime stories provide the structure for this news. Violent border crime has risen in rural areas, although average rates of violent crime have declined along the border. The repetition of border issues in television news has skyrocketed since 2005. This increased coverage, along with framed television news stories, has increased a fear of border crime. Politicians acknowledge these media-fed fears and make policy decisions based on a flow of skewed public opinion, again fed by frequent and framed television news. The result may be border crime policy based on irrational evaluations of real-world events.